I have a couple of introductory comments before I introduce our panel and get going. The first is, when Sharansky was being interrogated, and this KGB colonel told him that dismissed our movement as students and housewives, he had it partially right. Housewives indeed were leaders of this movement. And it was housewives that really taught me everything I knew about how to be an activist. Um, the KGB colonel's mistake was not in the characterization, but in the dismissal of our movement. And I know the organizers tried to have this panel be more representative, but for a variety of reasons, the women that we were trying to get on this panel are either out of the country or whatever, they couldn't be here. And I'm saying this as a disclaimer because given the way our movement was, it's a little strange to have four men up here. And I am hoping, I know there are some women in the audience that were active, and I'm hoping you will participate during the Q&A. And the second comment is that I was asked to be on the panel, then I was asked to moderate it, which I'm very happy to do. And I said to Justin, I will do that on the condition that I get to talk too, because I was also, I have a story to tell too. So I'm going to start, I want a little context and framing, and then I'm going to throw out a few questions to our panel. And after our discussion, we're going to open it up to all of you. So in 1970, a group of Soviet citizens attempted to steal an airplane and fly it from Leningrad to Helsinki and to freedom. That plan failed. They were all arrested before they got anywhere near an airplane, and most of them actually anticipated that. But they had a second objective, which was to call attention to the plight of Soviet Jews in a way that would illustrate that they lived inside a giant prison. And their effort to simply leave would be treated like a prison break, as it was. And they succeeded wildly in that second objective, including gaining the attention of a 13-year-old kid in Norwalk, Connecticut. Why this event and other actions of Soviet Jews not only captured my attention, but motivated me and many thousands of other Americans, including my co-panelists, to struggle for their freedom, that's among the questions that we're going to explore today. Our distinguished panel includes two former activists from Philadelphia and two from Northern California. I encourage you to read everyone's full bio in the program. And so briefly, we have first to my left, Frank Brodsky, the former co-chair of the Soviet Jewry Council of the JCRC of Greater Philadelphia. Next to Frank is Alan Molod, along with his wife, Shirley, a longtime Soviet Jewry activist in Philadelphia. Alan and Shirley traveled to the Soviet Union several times to meet with Refuseniks. And then all the way at the end is Morey Schapira, one of my mentors in the movement, and among other things, the former president of the Union of Council for Soviet Jews, and a seminal leader in the activist movement over multiple decades. So I'm going to throw out three questions to this group. The first is a why question, the second is a how question, and the third is a so what question. So the first question is why? What motivated you to get involved in this movement? What grabbed you and sustained your activism for decades? Frank, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Alan and then Morey.
In 1983, our daughter had her bat mitzvah in suburbs of Philadelphia. And as you heard, there were twinnings in those days. And she was twinned with a child in the Soviet Union. There was an empty chair on the bima, the stage. And she read some comments about Soviet Jewry. But it didn't grab me. I heard it. I knew a little bit about it. 2 years later, I was in my office, phone rang, and Alan Molod, sitting next to me, called me and said, Frankie, you going to the Golden Slipper board meeting tonight? And I said, yes. He said, give me a ride. In the car, I said, Alan, I heard you went to the Soviet Union to visit Refuseniks. What was it like? Well, in the 20 minutes or so that he was in my car, I was just blown away. I couldn't believe the information that he was telling me. It was so incredible. I went home that night. My wife, Bunny, was lying in bed reading. I said, Bunny, I was just with Alan Molod. He told me about going to the Soviet Union to visit Refuseniks. I must go. And if you won't go with me, I'm going myself. Well, anyway, she agreed. And several months later, the summer of 1985, we made our first trip to the Soviet Union. And since that time, I have reminded Alan almost every time I see him that he has changed my life. He took away all my free time. But what a change. And so we made our first trip to the Soviet Union in 1985. And we went in 1986. The first time in 1985, we were very thoroughly briefed. Philadelphia, which, by the way, was considered by the Refuseniks as probably the best trained city in the world in bringing travelers to the Soviet Union, had great people. Bernie and Lana Dishler, who were supposed to be on this panel, but because of illness couldn't make it, were our first briefers. And we had another great team there, the Smugglers, Joe and Connie Smuggler, Sasha's cousins, Bobby Morgenstern, and many, many others to go along with the people that you saw on Laura's film last night, the Glenn Richters, the Lynn Singers, and the other greats, the heroes of our movement. Anyway, we were thoroughly, thoroughly briefed. We went in 1985. I'll never forget, we walked in, knocked on the door, and when the person came and we met them and we had some smiles and we talked to them a little bit, but then we spent about 3 to 4 hours in an apartment. And when we left, we had tears in our eyes. Instead of smiling when we went in, we were almost crying as we left, as we heard the stories that these Refuseniks were telling us. So we went back in 1986. And when we called, and by the way, our system was you checked into your hotel, you didn't talk in your room because you knew the rooms were bugged, but you went outside the in-tourist hotel and there was a bank of telephones. And we knew that the American dime was the same size as the 2 kopeck piece. So we came with a roll of dimes, put the dime into the slot, called up, Shalom, this is a friend from Philadelphia. And when they heard that, they knew that we were somebody that was trained to come. And they would immediately say to us, well, I want you to do this. I want you to go to the corner. The metro station is there. Look for the metro with a green line. And we were already conditioned and told about all these things. So we looked for the green line. And then we also had a Soviet alphabet, Cyrillic alphabet. And we would look for the name of the station. And we were told you take the train and you get off at the 3rd stop and be in the first carriage. And we did all of that. And as hundreds of people are coming off the train and plain sullen faces, suddenly one person comes walking up to you, smiles, and says, Shalom. And by the way, I have to forgive me. I choke up quite often when I tell these stories. So if it happens more, you'll understand. Anyway, we met this person. We went back to their apartment. And so this went on. After the second trip in 1986, we decided to go again in 1987. So we did it 3 years in a row. And when we went in 1986 and we knocked on the door, they didn't know who was coming. They said, you, what are you doing here? Nobody ever comes to see us twice, 2 years in a row. The third time we came in 1987, knock on the door, what? This was winter of 1987. What are you doing here? It's so cold. It's snowy. You could be in a warm place. And we went through this. And by the way, in between those trips, in 1986, we were home, Bunny and I were home 3 days. And I received a call from our Soviet Jewry office in Philadelphia. And they said, we'd like you to go to Reykjavik tomorrow for the summit meeting. I said, I have jet lag. I just got home. They said, we know, but this is important and you have to go. And so I went. And by the way, when we were making these trips, we were paying our own expenses, 100% of the cost of everything we paid out of our pockets because we believed in this. And so in 1986, I needed credentials. The Jewish Exponent, our local newspaper, gave me a letter that said that I was a foreign correspondent for the Jewish Exponent. When I got to Reykjavik license, we left at about 11 o'clock at night out of Newark Airport. On the plane with us was the Soviet ambassador, also a writer, Nick Danilov, who had just been released from prison about a week or two earlier. He was on the plane with us, and there were some Refuseniks families, and we got there. We did our thing, came back the next afternoon. We were there we left 11 o'clock roughly at night, landed in Reykjavik 7 in the morning, did our thing, meeting with the world media, telling them the story of Refuseniks, got on a plane at 5 something and flew home. Never slept, took a toothbrush, toothpaste, and a book, and that's how we did it. So I'm going to stop there, but that's how I got so hooked.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. Alan, go ahead.
Am I close enough to this?
Yeah, let's
Look, bring it down.
go ahead. Yeah.
There? Okay. Good morning. Well, I think Zev did such an amazing job in describing how he got involved. I think my remarks will sort of be a small annex to his wonderful, wonderful speech. So I'm going to start by telling you a few things about me, which I hope doesn't sound like bragging, but its relevance will become clear in 2 or 3 minutes after I say it. So I first got involved with Jewish activism when I was 9 years old. I was 9 years old in 1946. My mother was a Jewish professional. She had been a teacher. And in Philadelphia in the early 50s, the American Jewish Congress was a men's organization, but there was a women's organization as sort of a auxiliary called Congresswomen. So my mother was the volunteer president, and when her term was up, they didn't want her to leave, so they created a paid professional executive director job and talked my mother into leaving her teaching job and becoming a full-time professor, a professional for Congresswomen. And Congresswomen then, just like Congressmen, were really obsessing about the possibility of a Jewish state. So in my home, when I was 9 years old, and in 1947, when I was 10 years old, talking about Israel was really consumed the conversation in my household. And of course, in 1948, my house never saw the joy that it saw in 1948 when the state of Israel was formed. So fast forward now to 1961. 1961, I was a law student. I took a leave of absence after 2 years in law school because I wanted to spend a year in London. And so I went to London and spent a year at the London School of Economics. And this was 1961. And so in a telephone conversation with my mother, she said, I've decided to go to Israel and meet my cousin. Now, what that meant was she had had a pen pal relationship with a cousin for over 30 years, but she had never met him. He was the son of one of my grandmother's brothers. So they were first cousins. And so she said, will you go with me? So I said, yeah, of course. So she came to London, picked me up. We spent a day or two in Paris, spent a day in Athens, and then went to Tel Aviv to meet this relative. It was probably the most emotional experience in my lifetime. And I'm a pretty old man now. Because we found him in the hospital from a car accident. It was horrible. But anyhow, and we met his daughter, who was more or less a contemporary of mine, named Ora. And we spent a couple of weeks there visiting that particular family. They were from Kibbutz Ein Harod. And we also did some touring around and visited points of interest and so on. And because of a connection, now this was my mother's family, but because of a connection I had with my father's family, when we stayed in Israel, when we were not on the kibbutz, we lived with this uncle from the Molod side of the family. And he happened to be a childhood buddy of Ben Zvi. Ben Zvi at that time was president of the state of Israel. So I wanted to go to the Eichmann trial, and my uncle, who we were staying with, said, I think I can arrange that for you. And sure enough, my mother and I got tickets to go to the Eichmann trial. So I spent a day in the Eichmann trial. I was also able, of course, of this connection, to be able to sit in with the news people where I could wear headphones and get simultaneous translations into English of what was going on. Even through the glass, I could hear the shrieks of the survivors who were in that audience as they listened to the testimony about what Eichmann had done. And that had a very strong impact on me. And I became very passionate about the state of Israel. So, and that was 1961. So I finally got back to the United States to start working at the beginning of 1965. And I joined a very large Jewish law firm, biggest of the Jewish law firms, and started to get involved in the Federation of Jewish Agencies as a fundraiser for the state of Israel. And that was in the late 60s and early 70s. I also became, when I had been an undergraduate, which was at Penn in Philadelphia, I had been active in the Hillel House. And so I also got active in the Hillel board and became the second, it became reconstituted as the Philadelphia Jewish Student Board. And I became the second president. Now, why is that relevant? The first president was a guy named Joe Smuckler. Now, at the same time,
I need to wrap it up.
Yeah. Okay.
Got more
So
questions.
I had a neighbor who was a dentist and a friend, happened to be Bernie Dischler. And I had longtime friends, social friends, named Stuart and Edith Workman. So I was in an environment involving Joe Smuckler, involving the Dischlers, and involving the Workmans.
Thank you, Alan.
I knew a lot about the Soviet Jewry movement.
Morey, your turn.
I am the luckiest man in the world. I was given the opportunity to work with the most noble, selfless people on both sides of the Iron Curtain. In 1969, I was a student in my senior year at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. And a package arrived at the Hillel House. And it was a package, I opened it up, and it was from Dr. Lou Rosenblum, one of the foundations of this movement. And he was then the president of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism, and it contained a box of New Year's greeting cards in English and in Russian, and it contained specific instructions on what to say and not to say in the card, and how to address a letter properly, and why it was important that they send these cards to refuseniks who wanted to get those cards in the former Soviet Union. I hadn't known anything about this issue. So all of a sudden, my consciousness was raised. When I graduated from school, I got to do the thing to me, which was the most important thing in my life, a chance to go to Israel. To go to Israel between, at that time in 1970, and I had an incredible experience. You can imagine what it was like between 1969 and 1973 in Israel. While there, I met some of the first people to come out of the former Soviet Union. Wow. To meet them touched me. I flew back to Boston. I started working as a research scientist there. And on the weekends, I asked my fellow scientists, what should I do for a weekend here? They said, go to the Boston Commons, and told me take the duck boats and see this, and Paul Revere there, and all the great history in Boston. So I drove down to the Commons, and I start walking through it, and I start hearing some voices. And I look, and there's a whole bunch of students holding a rally there. It was the New England Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. And I walked up to them, and I listened to the speakers, and I picked up the brochures. And then, of course, somebody walks up to me with a clipboard and said, hi, we're looking for volunteers. Would you like to help us? The rest is history. From a broader scope of things, in terms of personally, after I traveled to the Soviet Union with Glenn Richter, and you saw Glenn quoted extensively in the movie last night, it was a life-changing experience. And my parents were Shoah survivors, as were many of people in this room. And I remember my parents telling me that they were liberated by the Red Army, and that the leader of the military unit that freed them was a Jew who couldn't believe what he saw and was so stunned by the horrible things that went on. And what they did was, as my dad said, we knew what would happen to people to Jews who would be kept under Soviet occupation. They would be sent back east. And he said, so he and my mother did everything they could to go as far west as quickly as possible. And I realized one day that had they not been able to do so, and I would be a Soviet citizen because they were Soviet citizens captured after World War II, that would be me picketing the Kremlin and joining the refusenik movement there. I internalized that very deeply inside of me. In 19 if I look at it also from a larger perspective, in the time period of 1968 and 1969, Professor Kellner has written on this issue, there was a great deal going on in terms of an awakening of Jewish students in the United States. Every one of them grew 2 inches. They held their head higher instead of walking around like, Jewish students going to school. Israel won. They were proud of their Judaism, and they started protesting on behalf of what they wanted and believed in against the Jewish, quote unquote, establishment. They wanted money to fund the Soviet Jewry movement. They wanted more money spent on Jewish education, and in Boston in particular, less money spent on Jewish hospitals. Why did we need to be funding hospitals when we needed more Jewish education? There was a flourishing of free Jewish universities around. There were the beginning of movements like the Schapira movement, et cetera, which all were starting then. And Jewish students were part of an environment then of students wanting change for many different causes, and they were swept up in this as well, and I was one of them. And so for that combination of reasons, once I got started, I realized this is the reason that Hashem put me here on this earth.
Thank you. Thank you, Morey. Thank you, Morey. I just want to, I'm going to ask to hold the applause to the end because otherwise we won't be able to talk as much. So I just heard from my 3 co-panelists 3 themes that I think all contributed to my own involvement, and I think were fairly widespread. One is what I would say it was a people-to-people thing, that everyone here talked about how someone else got them involved. In Frank's case, it was Alan. In Alan's case, it was Enid and Stuart and Bernie and Lana and the Smugglers. And Morey talked about being on the Boston Commons, being invited in. And this people-to-people thing was, well, we didn't know any other way. There was no internet. We didn't often know what we were doing. And so we just brought people in on a personal basis. The second I want to touch on was the Holocaust. Harold Light, who founded the Bay Area Council for Soviet Jews, used to say, in talking about his generation, which was the generation before my own, it's not often you get a second chance to rescue your people. And I think that, first of all, for that generation, there was a tremendous amount of obviously sorrow, but also guilt about what American Jews did not do during the Holocaust. In my case, in my grandparents' apartment in the Bronx, on the bedroom wall, there was a photograph of two photographs of my grandparents' families in Poland. And in one of those photographs, they were this was from the 20s, and they were holding a little photo in the photo that had my grandparents and my uncles. And I could recognize them. And then there was another photo of my dad, who was a baby then in the 1920s. So I felt connected to this photograph. When I became a teenager, I realized every single person in that photograph who didn't leave expeditiously, either for the US or for Palestine, as it was called then, perished, and not quietly. And so this was part of my introduction to the Shoah, the Holocaust, in my own family. On my grandmother's kitchen wall, there was a plaque, a wooden plaque, and it said in Hebrew, Ha'asita hayom ba'ad amecha ve'artzecha. What have you done today on behalf of your people and your land? Mm-hmm. And I think that in my formative years, and my part of my motivation for joining this movement had to do with a conversation between that plaque on my grandmother's kitchen wall and that photograph in my grandparents' bedroom. And so that when that group of Jews tried to steal that airplane in 1970, something touched me very deeply. The third theme that certainly influenced me was I grew up at a time of great social upheaval in this country. I was very influenced by the civil rights movement and by Martin Luther King in particular. And so when I learned about Soviet Jews, for me, that was my civil rights movement. Those are my people. And I wanted to march for them in the same way that I was marching for Martin Luther King. And I think that had a great influence, certainly on my generation in the 60s and the 70s. After one quick story about my entrance as a teen, after 1970, I started wearing this big Magen, this big Star of David, which of course the movement was passing around, and I joined Student Struggle, even though I was just a little kid. I never met Glenn Richter or Jacob Birnbaum. I was a kid, but I would go into New York City for demonstrations, and I had this big Magen David on my neck, and the person whose name was on it was Mark Dimschitz, which was not the best name to be on your chest if you're a teenage boy, and that's your name. But I wore it anyway. And one day, an African-American friend said to me, "Why are you wearing that?" So I explained what I knew about Soviet Jews. But I also said, and this was also important, and this is something that I think Morey touched on toward the end of his talk. I said, I also wear it so people know that I'm a Jew. I probably said so people know I'm Jewish. And he looked at me and he said, and he rubbed his face and said, "Yeah, that's why I wear this skin, so people know I'm black." And many, many years later, I realized actually, that he had an insight into something that I didn't. He had no choice in the matter. But for me, I could pass and or try to pass. But I think these people in the Soviet Union were inspiring me to reclaim my own sense of who I was as a Jew. I want to get to our second question. The second question is a how question. When I was working, I felt that our movement rested on three legs. One was direct support for the people in the Soviet Union, moral support, spiritual, intellectual, material, whatever they needed. And that involved a travel program and all that went with that. The second was political pressure on the Kremlin via the leverage that we could exert on power centers here and around the world. And then the third was public pressure, making life miserable for anyone responsible for Soviet public relations. Demonstrations, rallies, boycotts. I used to say our pen against the KGB sword. So what I want to ask of my co-panelists, and this time I'll start with Morey and go back. Can you share a story of how you worked during those years that was somehow impactful or perhaps representative, emblematic of the way that we worked as a movement, that can sort of illustrate what it was like for the folks listening?
Yes.
And we all need to be brief.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Bay Area Council was based in San Francisco. If you wanted to protest against the Soviets in the United States, you either had to go to Washington, D.C., where they had an embassy, New York, where they had the New York mission, or the consulate in San Francisco. So it was an additional burden, but an opportunity for us. Sharansky, as we all know and saw in Laura's film yesterday, was arrested in 1977. And of course, we knew that things were going to be worse after the USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1980. And he was in isolation. And there were serious concerns about his health, et cetera, et cetera. And so we knew that just doing the same old wasn't going to work. From a higher level, Soviets would do something terrible. We were on defense. We would respond back. They would do something worse. We would have another rally, et cetera. We had to do something different. And what we did is we went on the offense. We held a tribunal that put the Soviet Union on trial We called up Alan Dershowitz, who was Sharansky's American attorney. We called up Professor Erwin Kotler, who was his Canadian attorney. We got 3 distinguished judges from California, one who was active on the California Supreme Court, one who had just retired from the Supreme Court, and a local judge to act as a tribunal. The Soviet Union was served process, as in law. In other words, there was a 150-page book of accusations showing how the Soviets had violated their own laws and that they were going to be held accountable, and they had to show up and attend this trial. Now, you and I know that they wouldn't show up because for obvious reasons. Okay, so what we did was we hired an attorney who was a Russian emigre who was living in Los Angeles, who knew Russian law, and it was his job to defend the Soviets in this trial that we had. The trial was held on a cold, rainy night in San Francisco. 400 people attended, including Avital Sharansky, and to be able to sit back and watch Alan Dershowitz and Erwin Kotler give him a left-right combination, it was something just amazing, okay? Obviously, the tribunal met. This trial took 3 hours, and at the end, they declared the Soviet Union guilty, okay? And the reverberations were felt around the world. Now, one last interesting note. Towards the end of the trial, one of the members of the Bay Area Council staff came up and whispered in my ear, "Turn around and look in the last row on the right side." And there, just like in the movies, are 3 guys in black trench coats, black suits. 2 of them were wearing sunglasses inside at night and sitting there by themselves in isolation, taking it all in. Our message was delivered to Moscow.
Well, I want to add that Sharansky had been on a hunger strike because the prison hadn't given him his book of Psalms. That was a precious thing for him. He was on a hunger strike until he got his Psalms back. And the next day, we got word that the hunger strike had ended because they gave him his Psalms back. We don't know if our tribunal had anything to do with it, but we like to think we certainly gave a little extra push. Alan, go ahead. Thank you, Morey.
In my last remarks, I said that I would make relevant the information, and I never had an opportunity to do that. I want to take 1 or 2 minutes to do that. I will answer your question first, so that I do.
Okay, okay.
Okay. So please. The couple of things that I did, I think, were very helpful. I was chairman of an organization that raised funds for 5 national student organizations, one of which was SSSJ, Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. And I was very instrumental in making sure that they were well funded. The second thing that I did, which is a sort of an interesting story, I was a fundraiser for Senator Scoop Jackson, and with 2 other people. One of them was Joe Smuckler, and the other guy was a guy named Sonny Dogle, and we were raising funds for Scoop. Unfortunately, after the Pennsylvania primary, he was not proceeding very well and decided to withdraw. A few days after that, I got a call from Harriet Zimmerman, who was Carter's Jewish community outreach person, who I knew casually. Never had a conversation with her, but we knew to say hello. And she called me and said, "I know that you were raising funds for Scoop, but now that he's out of it, would you consider raising funds for Jimmy Carter?" I said, "I don't know anything about Jimmy Carter." So she says, "Well, who do you work there with?" So I said, "There are 2 other guys. The 3 of us are doing it." She says, "Well, I'd like to have you come down and meet Jimmy Carter, talk to him, ask him questions, see if you like him. And if you do, maybe you work for him." So I got together with Joe and Sonny. Sonny did not want to go down. Joe Smuckler said, sure, let's go down. And so we talked about it and we said, you know what, let's take a bracelet down and see if we can get Jimmy Carter to wear it. So we went down to meet him. He came across very well. He was very casual, relaxed, sat on the end of the table, took all questions, and we liked him. And we then said to him, just Joe and I, can we speak to you privately? So he said, yeah. So he stepped off into a corner somewhere. And we asked him if he knew anything about the Soviet Jewry movement. He said, yeah, he knew what it was about. And we explained a little more of it, of what it was about, particularly the adoption program. And we said to him, would you be willing to adopt a Soviet Jew and make a public announcement that you had adopted a Soviet Jew and name your adoptee? And he said, and he didn't think a long time about it. He said, yes, I will do that. We gave him a slate back bracelet, which is the one we brought down for him. Joe and I happened to both be wearing slate back bracelets at the time. And he put it on right there. And sure enough, and we said to him, if you do what you just said you're going to do, we're going to raise some money for you. And about 4 or 5 days later, he made that public announcement. So what Joe and I accomplished was we had the President of the United States endorse the movement and adopt the Soviet Jew.
Thank you,
That
Al.
was pretty good. Now, what I wanted to say and what didn't have time to finish before was, question one was what motivated you? And I never really got to that. All I did was give you some biography about myself. The reason I gave that biography about my connection to the state of Israel was because when I learned what was going on with the Soviet Jewry movement, the thing that turned me on was there was a possibility we could bring 1 million or more Jews to the state of Israel. That's what turned me on. The idea that I could play a role in bringing that many Jews to the state of Israel, that's what motivated me. I mean, happy to help Jews in trouble. Of course, I do that wherever they were. But that's not got my passions boiling. Then in 1977, we went to the Soviet Union and we fell in love with the Refuseniks. And then we had a second passion, a new passion. We want these people free. And that began driving us. And whether they came to America or England or Brazil or Madrid, wherever they wanted to go, we hoped they would go to Israel, but we wanted them free. And that was what was driving.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Along with the Israel. So it was
Thank
a
you.
twofer that drove us. And that was what motivated us.
Frank, your turn.
After having done the first 3 trips that I mentioned with my wife, Bunny, when I came home, I had a lot of pictures and I was going on the speaking circuit, you might say, and I was talking about all of the new friends that we had that we considered family. And in fact, when Laura's movie was on last night, I could easily say, Laura, that we visited about 80% of those people that you showed in the film. We were in their apartments with them and spending time with them and becoming family members with them. When we got back in 1988, a group of us from Philadelphia arranged to go into the Soviet embassy in Washington. And before we went, we had gotten a list of 11 families that wanted their freedom. And we got in, we demonstrated, by the way, across the street from the Soviet embassy. And then we got into the Soviet embassy, and each of us had a job to do. And my job was to talk about the 11 families that we wanted to get out. And when we told their stories, the Soviet official said to us, you know, you keep telling us that if we give them their freedom, they will go to Israel. And when we let them out, they go to Brighton Beach, which happened to be true in many cases. But we insisted that they have to get out to go to Israel. And sure enough, in about 2 months, all of those families got their permission and they all went to Israel. So that was a very successful thing. But in Philadelphia, some of the things that we did, for example, and last night, looking at the film, it showed a demonstration, a candlelight demonstration. We did that in Philadelphia with Natan Sharansky on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, Main Street in Center City, Philadelphia. And Natan Sharansky and our late Senator John Hines was with us, the mayor of Philadelphia, Ed Rendell, who also went to the Soviet Union to visit Refuseniks, who was with us, the leaders of our community, the smugglers, the dishlers. We all marched up the Benjamin Franklin Parkway with candles. And it was absolutely an unbelievable sight to see, just like that movie showed last night. We went up to the art museum, went up the steps that Rocky ran up in the movie. We had our big meeting at the top of the art museum. All of the people spoke. In fact, people who had been visiting the Soviet Jews spoke at that particular meeting. It was incredible. And we got stories all about this in all of the local newspapers. As a result of that, I wrote a column for the Jewish Exponent that was published. And then we had all of our meetings, and I was going out along with other people in our committee, and we were speaking at the B'nai B'rith lodges. We were speaking at the Hadassah groups. We were speaking at the Hillels. Any place, so churches even, any organization that was interested, we would have a speaker that would go out and tell the story. And I had slides that I took sometimes and we showed them. But we got this story out to where it became not just a Jewish story, it became a human rights story. And we showed where Black people from Philadelphia in the city council went to the Soviet Union to visit Refuseniks. We taught them about the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King was supporting of the Soviet Jewry movement. So we let them know that Christians as well as Jews were part of this whole program. And I have to include a special story that I told everywhere I went. In 1987, Bunny and I were in Leningrad. And we visited a family, a young lady whose husband was in prison. And she had a beautiful little child with her. And two women who went with Bunny and I looked at this young mother and said, "Your baby is so beautiful. She should be on the cover of a magazine." No one knew it. But I then reached into my canvas bag that I was carrying, and I had a copy of the National B'nai B'rith magazine with them on the cover. That family, by the way, is Marina and Lev Furman. Just so you know. And Marina still has that magazine that I gave her, and I understand it's framed in your house. And Marina... And there is the magazine, you can see it, that I gave to Marina. Now, the story does not end there, because the next day, Marina went to the prison and she wanted to let Lev know that they were okay. And they gave her a hard time and no. Marina takes out that magazine and she shows it to them and she says, "Do you see this? We are world famous. This is Time magazine in America." They didn't know. And as a result of that, they took the information, the things that Marina brought for Lev, And of course, we always said next year in Jerusalem. And then the following year, we were in Jerusalem and we hugged. And for the first time, we got a chance to see Lev. So
That's a
I wanted
great
to tie
story.
that.
Thank you, Frank.
Okay, let me just finish it with Marina's daughter. That beautiful young girl who was 10 months old at that time grew up. And by the way, they now live, they're neighbors of ours. And we were invited to Aliyah's bat mitzvah. And it was beautiful. And Dan Grossman from Leningrad consulate was there. And then when Aliyah got a little older, she was married and we went to the funeral. Not a funeral, I'm sorry. God bless. We went to the wedding. We went to the wedding. Forgive me.
Thank you, Frank.
So that's it.
Thank you, Frank. I'm gonna just tell one very quick thing, and then we're gonna move to Q&A. For me, I'm gonna tell a personal story. I don't think I've ever told this publicly. You know, in those days, we were completely consumed with the movement. I got engaged, was married in 83. My wife was having these recurring nightmares. The two of us were under the chuppah, and Avital Sharansky would show up and say, David, Anatoly needs you. And I would leave the wedding, and the whole thing would be a mess. So I had to find some way of doing something that was separate from I promised my wife that our wedding would just be our wedding. But there's a Jewish tradition of Sheva Brachot, which is after the wedding, you have these 7 nights of parties and different things. So one of them, we agreed, so one day after the wedding, we organized what we called a proxy wedding in Union Square. The year earlier, I had been in the Soviet Union. I met with someone I became very close with named Yuri Tarnopolsky, who was then subsequently arrested. He was in prison in 83. So to call attention to Yuri's plight and also to just some of the difficulties of the Soviets' repression of Jewish religion, we decided to have a proxy wedding because Yuri and his wife Olga were unable to have a Jewish wedding in Kharkov. So we had this proxy wedding in Union Square. We had hundreds of people show up. It was a huge press event. And then after, of course, it's a wedding, you have dancing. We moved everyone to outside the Soviet consulate, and we had a wild dancing party outside the consulate. So that was for completely selfish reasons because it enables me to have my wedding and at the same time call attention to Tarnopolsky's case. We're going to move to Q&A, and I do hope through the Q&A we can talk a little bit, and I have a couple of comments about the so what, which is what might we learn from this that would be helpful for future generations. I see Sasha has his hand up first.
And then also, I want to make sure I'm here with Miriam Rosenblum, so I want to make sure to hear from her too, since she was involved in it. But can we just start with you?
Let's start with Miriam, and then Sasha.
I want you to weigh in on anything that you might have heard, because I know that you are a part of this also. Then we're going to get then right to Sasha.
Yeah. Well, when you were speaking at the beginning, the 4 of you on the panel about when they started, it made me go back on my own memories, which started in the early 60s. I grew up in a household where, as was mentioned, Lou Rosenblum was my father. And when I was 12 years old, I was asked to be in a movie. He decided that we needed to inform Jews in the West about the movement more, and that a movie, which became eventually to be called Before Our Eyes, was produced. My dad wasn't able to take a film crew into the USSR back in the 60s, so he had to invent a Soviet Jewish family. I was cast as the daughter. And that was the beginning of my journey. Through high school is when I met Zev Yaroslavsky. I was only 16 years old, and my father had invited him to speak at a meeting in the Midwest. And it just grew from there. So meeting and then eventually being able to meet Jews in the Soviet Union, And my father also brought, I think, one of the earliest Jews to get out, Luba Bershatskaya, in around 66. She stayed at our house. I mean, how could you not get involved with all this happening as an impressionable young person? But the opportunity then to meet the Jews behind the Soviet Union was so formative for everybody. I think in the movement on both sides, and as was described, for us to be able to go over there, and then as the early refuseniks were able to get out, that helped cement that relationship on both sides of the Iron Curtain, and has brought us to today, which is an amazing celebration of that 30-year movement.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you. Question is Sasha.
I have a question to our panelists, and maybe David Waksberg will be the one who can answer my question. We've heard about the movement which you organized here, and I'm a result of your movement and your efforts staying here and being free. We live in a world with growing anti-Semitism right now everywhere, and especially in our country. And it's remind me the time when I was a student in a school where I was pushed to condemn Israel in front of my school. What would you advise the young generation? How can you pass the flame of the movement which you organized to struggle the modern wave of anti-Semitism, especially in the United States?
Wow. You want to take a stab at that, Morey?
Okay. We had the pleasure 3 weeks ago of having a Zoom with Isabella Tabarovsky. I hope that's a familiar name to many people, and if it isn't, it should be. She helps connect the dots between the classic Soviet anti-Semitism of Lenin, of Stalin, of the Black Years, etc., to the anti-Semitism that you see on the campuses today. And it's important for people to know that there is a connection, as well as you've heard before, what I saw from Soviet Jews, that they basically were telling the KGB, you can harass me, you can arrest me, you can beat me, you could send me to the gulag, but I'm no longer scared of you. And that's what the KGB didn't want to hear, because in a society that was held together by fear, for somebody to say, I'm no longer scared of you, they knew that this was going to be the beginning of the end. And what we need to do is tell the story of what went on, be as an inspirational tool to young Jews today. They have grown up knowing none of this, and unfortunately, they have been victimized by KGB-style propaganda. And by the way, the KGB has been very busy manipulating what's going on TikTok, as well as our enemies in the Islamic countries. And so for those who've been brainwashed, I don't know if there's any hope, but for the majority who haven't been brainwashed, and I believe that's probably 90% of the young Jews, we need to tell them this story and let them meet the people in this room and learn more about it, I think, if we are to be able to reclaim them.
I just want to add one comment. Thank you, Morey. I'm not an expert in this. A lot of people are studying this. I'm not sure anyone really has a great handle on it, to be honest. But I want to talk from my own experience back then, here, and for sure there. The thing that always most concerned me, and most concerns me now, actually, is not the anti-Semites. It's what I would call the internalized anti-Semitism. And, I'm, among other things, I'm thankful to Soviet Jews for helping me understand, again, what that Black friend of mine pointed out, that this is something I can proclaim and be proud of, as you talked about from your own story. The thing that I'm most worried about when I read all of the stories of the last several years is, again, it's not all the demonstrators and all the things that they're saying. It's when I hear about Jewish students who are just trying to get by and pass and like hide their Jewishness and hide their Magen David, and so no one will know. And I get it. If I mean, I didn't have to walk across Columbia University's campus or anything. I get it. But I'm seeing it among high school kids too, and I'm seeing it among adolescents. And I don't have the answer, Sasha, but to me, this is what needs to be, this is what I hope we as educators, which I also am in another life, can focus on, is helping young Jews understand, irrespective of what goes on outside, who they are, and to take pride in that and to love that. I don't know the specifics of how to do it. I have some thoughts on it, but it's actually, maybe that'll be a topic for another symposium. We have more questions in the audience? We have Liv Foreman.
Can I pass the mic?
Maybe it's question to the third panel. It's a little question, but it's question of grandfather of educator. I was teacher in the Jewish day school. What happened? It's it's question to you, Frank, to you, Alan. Why our grandchildren don't know Americans' Jewry history? They don't know about their heroes. It is the golden page of the American Jewry. Why it goes away? Why not in the Jewish school not teaching these things? Maybe it's to the third question, to the third panel question.
Alan or Frank, do you have a comment?
Yeah. Well, as I think we all know, the young generation today lives on the telephones. And they probably spent more time on TikTok than they spend on anything else. And so I guess the challenge is, until they can be wed or extracted from that lifestyle, they're not going to be able to do a lot of other things. That one of the biggest messages of the Soviet Jewry movement was that a small group of people who are committed can achieve great things. If you would have asked Jakob Birnbaum or
Rosenblum.
Pardon?
Lou Rosenblum.
Yeah, Rosenblum and
Glenn Richter.
particularly, well, I don't know why I'm blanking out on his name, but Glenn Richter, who had a big impact on me, by the way.
We don't have
He's the
time. I
last
just
person who I should forget. And you asked them, what do you want to do? And say, well, we're some students and we're going to change the policy of the Soviet Union. That would be ludicrous, but they did it. So the power of ordinary people, if they're committed and they can increase their size and they can stick with it, they can make totally unpredictable changes just from their commitment. But how do you get them committed? How do you get them to put their phone down, or put their phone in their pocket, so that you can explain to them what they have the power to do if they're prepared to do it and if they want to do it? And I don't know the answer to that. This is a generational thing. Jews, Gentiles, that doesn't matter. They live on their phones. They don't watch movies because they take too long. They like a minute and a half clips. And I don't know how you can find the Glenn Richters in today's student population.
Thank you, Alan. Frank has just 1 minute comment, and then I'm going to wrap up.
I want to close this session and tell you a very, very short story. In 1986, when Bunny and I were in the Soviet Union, I requested from our office to give me the names of women whose husbands are in prison. I want to make sure that we visit the wives and let them know. And one of the places we visited was a place in Moscow, and there were two wives, Natasha Ratner and Tanya Sunshine were there. And we heard their stories. We cried a little bit. We said goodbye to them. We hugged Tanya on the street when she got us a taxi. And I said to her, Tanya, next year in Jerusalem. The following year, Bunny and I were in Israel on a Federation mission, and they said, we have to change the mission. There's a plane in the air right now coming to Ben Gurion University Airport. And we went there and we saw the plane unload. And who was on the plane but Zakhar Sunshine getting off with Tanya, his wife. We could never believe this happened. Today, before this meeting started, this session started, Tanya, who is here, came over to me and said hello to me, and I couldn't believe it. And wherever you are, is Tanya? So this is a fabulous, fabulous success story.
So just to thank you, Frank. Yes, and thank you for being here, Tanya. Just to wrap up on this so what question, you know, I met with Andrei Sakharov in Moscow, and he told me the only thing we can be certain of is the consequence of doing nothing, and that is nothing. What we can't know is what will be the consequence of our actions, and I think that we all took a lot of action. We were not, as I think Zev mentioned, we weren't hobbled by the constraints of experience. And my takeaway is that when there's a moral imperative, you act. You use your brain, you be creative, you don't be an idiot, but you don't let your lack of expertise or the negativity of others stop you. And I'll just say one little vignette during my time as an activist, because more than once, dismissing our efforts as futile, a Jewish leader told me, you're banging your head against the wall. And he was right. And it was immensely frustrating. And it gave me a headache. But we discovered that if we kept banging our heads against the wall, and if we did it in just the right ways, we'd make a hole in that wall. And then eventually, through that hole, human beings would crawl out to freedom. Thank you.